dog had been there so long that some people assumed he belonged to the shelter. Not officially, of course. But after 742 days, behind the same chain-link fences, watching thousands of visitors walk past his kennel without stopping, he had become something else entirely. A fixture, a forgotten presence, a quiet pair of brown eyes in the corner of a building full of barking dogs and second chances. And on a cold February morning in western Pennsylvania, as snow drifted across the parking lot of the Beaver County Humane Society, nobody knew that the next few hours would change everything. Not because someone came looking for him, not because his picture went viral, not because a celebrity stepped in. The truth was much simpler than that, and somehow much more powerful. His name was Duke. He was a mixed breed dog with a broad chest, white paws and a face that looked older than it should have. At 6 years old, he wasn't considered old, but shelter life had a way of adding years to animals. The staff could see it. The volunteers could see it. Even visitors who spent only a few minutes near his kennel could sense something different about him. Duke wasn't aggressive. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't even particularly difficult. He was simply defeated. Not completely, just enough. Just enough that people noticed. The shelter itself sat on the edge of town, surrounded by patches of woods and quiet roads lined with modest homes. Inside, life moved according to routines. Morning feeding, cleaning kennels, medical checks, exercise schedules, adoption appointments, fundraisers, paperwork, more paperwork. Every day looked a lot like the day before. But Duke had watched those days pile up longer than almost any other dog in the building. When he first arrived, things had been different. According to his intake records, he had been surrendered by a family going through a housing crisis. No abuse, no neglect, no dramatic rescue story. Just life falling apart faster than they could stop it. The family had cried when they left him. The shelter staff remembered that. His original owner had knelt beside him in the intake room for nearly 20 minutes before finally standing. Nobody ever forgot what she said before walking out. "Please tell him I didn't want this." Then she left, and Duke never saw her again. For the first few months, everyone assumed he'd be adopted quickly. He was healthy, house-trained, friendly, good with people, good on a leash. Those dogs usually didn't stay long. Weeks maybe, a few months at most. But something strange happened. Potential adopters kept choosing other dogs. A younger dog, a fluffier dog, a smaller dog, a dog with a more dramatic story, again and again. Duke became the dog people considered right before they picked someone else. At first, nobody worried. Then 6 months passed. Then a year. Then another. New dogs arrived and left. Entire generations of shelter volunteers came and went. Even kennel assignments changed. But Duke remained. By the beginning of his second year, he had become known among the staff as the gentleman. Not because he demanded attention, because he never did. While other dogs barked when visitors entered the adoption wing, Duke usually sat quietly, watching, waiting. Sometimes that helped. Sometimes people stopped. But often it hurt. Families interpreted his silence as disinterest. Children rushed toward louder dogs. Visitors walked past without ever learning who he was. And every time it happened, the staff felt it. Especially Melissa. Melissa Grant had worked at the shelter for nearly 11 years. At 38, she knew every type of animal heartbreak there was. Dogs abandoned after holidays. Senior pets surrendered because of medical bills. Owners forced to choose between housing and companionship. She had learned to protect herself emotionally. At least most of the time. Duke made that difficult. Because unlike many long-term shelter dogs, he never stopped hoping. Every morning, when the front doors opened, he stood. Every afternoon, when visitors entered the kennel area, he looked up. Every evening, when volunteers walked through saying goodbye, he watched them leave. Still still waiting, still believing someone might come. Melissa often wondered if that made things worse. Some dogs adapted to shelter life. Duke never really did. One evening after closing, she sat outside his kennel while finishing paperwork. The building had become quiet. Most of the dogs were asleep. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Duke rested near the gate, his head on his paws. "You know," she said softly, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." His tail thumped once against the floor. Melissa smiled, then immediately felt tears threatening. Because she wasn't talking to him. Not really. She was talking to herself. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The longer Duke stayed, the harder adoption became. Potential adopters always asked the same question. Why has he been here so long? And there was never a good answer. No answer that sounded reassuring. No answer that didn't create doubt. People assumed there had to be a hidden problem. Something they weren't being told. Something wrong. But there wasn't. Just bad timing, bad luck, and hundreds of tiny moments where someone chose another dog instead. As winter deepened across Pennsylvania, the shelter prepared for another adoption event. Banners went up. Social media posts were scheduled. Volunteers organized supplies. The goal was simple. Find homes before spring. Melissa updated Duke's profile again. New photos. New description. Fresh wording. Anything to help. But as she looked at his adoption record that evening, one number stopped her cold. 742 days. She stared at it longer than she should have. Because for the first time, a thought entered her mind that she had spent 2 years refusing to consider. What if Duke never left? What if this place became the only home he ever knew again? Outside, snow began falling harder. Inside, Duke slept quietly in his kennel, unaware that hundreds of miles away, another lonely person was sitting alone in a house that no longer felt like home. A person who wasn't looking for a dog. A person who wasn't planning to visit a shelter. A person who had no idea that one decision, made almost by accident, was about to collide with Duke's life in a way neither of them could possibly imagine. And when that moment finally arrived, it wouldn't just save a dog. It would force 2 broken lives to ask the same question. Could either of them learn how to start over? The man who would eventually change Duke's life spent most evenings sitting at the same kitchen table, staring at the same untouched chair across from him. His name was Ethan Parker. He was 43 years old and lived in a small town outside Erie, Pennsylvania, about 2 hours north of the shelter. If you met him at the local hardware store or saw him filling his truck at the gas station, nothing about him would seem unusual. He worked as a maintenance supervisor for a regional manufacturing company. He paid his bills on time. He mowed his lawn. He waved to neighbors. He attended community events when people invited him. From the outside, he looked like a man whose life was stable. The reality was much different. 2 years earlier, Ethan's wife, Sarah, had died after a sudden illness. The diagnosis had arrived without warning. The decline had happened faster than anyone expected. And then she was gone. 21 years of marriage reduced to photographs, memories, and a silence so heavy that it seemed to settle into the walls of their home. People often talked about grief as though it followed predictable stages. Ethan had discovered that grief was far less organized than that. Some mornings he woke up feeling almost normal. Other days a grocery receipt with Sarah's. Handwriting on it could destroy him for hours. There were moments he thought he was healing. Then there were moments when he felt trapped on the exact same day she died. His daughter Emily was 20 years old and attending college in Pittsburgh. She called regularly, visited when she could, worried about him constantly. Ethan knew that. He also knew he wasn't making things easy. The house remained exactly as Sarah had left it. Her favorite coffee mug still sat in the cabinet. Her gardening gloves remained hanging in the garage. Her side of the closet remained untouched. Friends encouraged him to move forward. Family members suggested counseling. Co-workers invited him fishing or golfing. He usually declined, not because he wanted to be alone, because after a while loneliness becomes familiar, and familiar things can feel strangely safe. One Sunday afternoon, Emily came home for the weekend. The visit started pleasantly enough. Lunch, conversation, a walk through town, but tension had been building for months. Eventually it surfaced. It always did. "Dad," Emily said gently as they sat in the living room. You can't keep living like this." He knew exactly what she meant. "I am living." "No." She looked around the room. "You exist here." Ethan sighed. "Emily, I'm serious." She wasn't angry. That made it harder. "I know you miss Mom." His eyes dropped. "I miss her too." The room grew quiet. Then she added something unexpected. "I think she'd be worried." That landed harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel, because it was probably true. Sarah had been the kind of person who adopted stray cats, remembered birthdays, and somehow made strangers feel welcome within minutes of meeting them. She believed life should keep moving, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Ethan changed the subject. Emily let him. But the conversation stayed with both of them. After she returned to Pittsburgh, Ethan found himself wandering through rooms late at night. Looking, thinking, remembering, questioning things he had avoided questioning. One evening he opened the garage and discovered several old storage boxes. Inside were photographs from years earlier, camping trips, birthday parties, road trips, family vacations. And in dozens of those pictures appeared a golden retriever named Molly. Molly had been Emily's childhood dog. She had lived nearly 14 years before passing away. During Emily's senior year of high school, Sarah had adored that dog. The entire family had. For a long time afterward, nobody wanted another pet. The grief felt too fresh. Then Sarah became sick. And afterward, life became focused on entirely different losses. As Ethan flipped through photographs, he noticed something. Many of the happiest pictures weren't centered on people. They were centered on moments. And Molly seemed to be present in nearly all of them, not as the star, as the thread connecting everyone else. The realization lingered. A week later, Ethan mentioned it during a phone call with Emily. "You were looking at old photos." "Yeah, and?" He hesitated. "There were a lot of pictures of Molly." Emily laughed softly. "That's because she inserted herself into everything." For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled. Then Emily said something he wasn't expecting. "Have you ever thought about getting another dog?" The answer arrived immediately. No, too quickly, too defensively. Even he recognized it. Emily noticed too. "Why not? It wouldn't be the same." "I know." Silence. Then she added quietly, "It isn't supposed to be." The conversation ended soon afterward, but her words stayed with him. Days became weeks. Winter slowly gave way to the first signs of spring. Snowbanks shrank. Road crews repaired potholes. People started talking about baseball again. Life moved forward whether anyone was ready or not. One Friday afternoon, Ethan stopped at a local diner after work, a place he'd been visiting for years. The waitress knew his order. The customers knew his name. As he waited for coffee, he noticed a community bulletin board near the entrance. Most people ignored it. Lost cats, church events, yard sales, local fundraisers. One flyer caught his attention. Pete Adoption Weekend. Over 40 dogs seeking homes. He almost looked away. Then something made him pause. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe boredom. Maybe Emily's voice still echoing somewhere in his mind. Whatever the reason, he found himself reading the entire flyer. A shelter volunteer had attached photographs beneath the announcement. Several dogs smiled toward the camera. One looked playful. Another looked energetic. A third wore a colorful bandana. And then there was Duke. The photograph wasn't remarkable. In fact, it was probably the least eye-catching image on the board. No funny costume. No dramatic pose. Just a brown dog sitting quietly, looking directly into the camera. For reasons Ethan couldn't explain, he kept staring. A customer walked between him and the bulletin board. The moment broke. He returned to his table, finished his coffee, paid his bill, left. The entire thing should have ended there. Instead, he found himself thinking about that dog during the drive home. Not obsessively, just occasionally. A strange little thought that kept resurfacing. The following day, he looked up the shelter's website, only out of curiosity. At least that's what he told himself. He browsed a few adoption profiles, then found Duke. The profile was simple. Name, Duke. Age, 6 years. Good with people. House trained. Long-term resident. Days in shelter, 742. Ethan stared at the number. 742 days. More than 2 years. His chest tightened unexpectedly. He clicked away, closed the website, told himself it wasn't his problem. But later that night, he returned. And this time he read every word. The next morning, while making coffee, he caught himself checking the shelter's address. That should have been his first warning. Because people rarely drive 2 hours to visit the dog. They aren't interested in meeting. Yet that's exactly what Ethan was beginning to consider. The problem was that he couldn't figure out why. He wasn't looking for companionship. He wasn't trying to replace Molly. He wasn't trying to fix his grief. And he definitely wasn't planning to adopt a dog. At least that's what he kept saying. But by the middle of the week, a question had taken root in his mind. A simple question, one he couldn't seem to silence. If a dog had been waiting 742 days, what happened when he finally stopped believing someone was coming? And for reasons Ethan couldn't yet understand, he felt compelled to find out. The drive to the shelter took a little over 2 hours. Ethan almost turned around 3 separate times before he got there. The first time happened 20 minutes into the trip. He convinced himself the whole idea was ridiculous. The second time came when he stopped for gas outside Meadville. The third happened less than 5 miles from the shelter itself. Each time, he came up with perfectly reasonable arguments. He worked long hours. He lived alone. He hadn't owned a dog in years. His house wasn't prepared. His schedule wasn't prepared. His life wasn't prepared. Every argument made sense. Yet somehow he kept driving. By the time he pulled into the shelter parking lot, his stomach felt strangely nervous. Not excited. Not hopeful. Nervous. As if he were about to walk into something much larger than he intended. The building looked exactly like hundreds of shelters across America. Practical. Modest. Functional. A place focused on helping animals rather than impressing visitors. A volunteer greeted him inside. First visit? Yeah. Looking for a dog? Ethan hesitated. Just looking. The volunteer smiled. We hear that a lot? That answer somehow embarrassed him. Because it felt true. He wasn't there to adopt. At least not officially. The volunteer handed him a visitor badge and pointed him toward the adoption wing. The familiar sounds hit immediately. Barking. Metal kennel doors. Footsteps. Voices. Dogs calling out for attention. Some stood against kennel gates. Others spun excited circles. A few barked continuously. Ethan walked slowly, reading profiles, watching interactions, trying not to think too much. Then he reached Duke's kennel. The dog was asleep. At first, Ethan thought he might have the wrong kennel. Most dogs reacted immediately when people approached. Duke didn't. He simply remained curled on a blanket in the back corner. A volunteer passing nearby noticed. "That's Duke." Ethan nodded. The volunteer smiled sadly. "He naps a lot these days." Something about that sentence felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried years of disappointment behind it. A few seconds later, Duke lifted his head. Their eyes met. The dog stood slowly. No barking, no jumping, no excitement, just quiet observation. Duke walked toward the front of the kennel and sat down, watching, waiting. Ethan found himself doing the same. For nearly a minute, neither moved. Then Duke's tail wagged once, just once. A small movement, almost cautious, almost uncertain, as though he had learned not to expect too much. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. Not love, not connection, recognition. That was the closest word. Recognition. Because he knew that look. He had seen it in mirrors. The look of someone who still hoped, but no longer trusted hope completely. "He's a good dog," Ethan turned. Melissa stood nearby holding a clipboard. She had spent enough years at the shelter to identify interested visitors from across a room. She recognized the look immediately. Not certainty, curiosity. Sometimes curiosity became adoption. Sometimes it didn't. But it was always worth encouraging. "How long has he been here?" Ethan asked. Melissa already knew he had read the profile. Everyone asked anyway. 742 days. Saying it aloud still felt unreal. Ethan glanced back toward Duke. "Why?" The question carried no judgment, just confusion. Melissa smiled sadly. "If I knew the answer, he'd probably be home already." They spent nearly 20 minutes talking about Duke's personality, his routines, his history, his strengths, his quirks. The more Ethan listened, the stranger it became. Nothing sounded wrong. Nothing sounded concerning. Everything sounded normal. Maybe that was the problem. Many adopters wanted instant emotional sparks, dramatic rescue stories, instant chemistry, something memorable. Duke was simply a good dog. Steady, reliable, patient. The older Melissa became, the more she realized how underrated those qualities were. Eventually, she asked the question she always asked. "Would you like to meet him?" Ethan almost said no. The word reached the edge of his lips, then disappeared. "Okay." Melissa nodded. A few minutes later, they entered a fenced outdoor area behind the shelter. Spring air carried traces of melting snow and damp earth. Duke stepped into the yard beside them. For several seconds, nothing happened. The dog wandered, sniffed grass, explored familiar corners, ignored Ethan completely. Melissa tried not to laugh. It usually goes one of two ways. What? They either jump all over visitors or pretend visitors don't exist. Ethan smiled. "So which is this?" "Duke?" She watched the dog. "Honestly, I'm not sure anymore." That answer lingered, because it was true. Years in the shelter had changed him. Not dramatically, subtly. The kind of change people rarely noticed until it became permanent. Eventually, Duke wandered closer. Not directly, in an arc. Slowly, cautiously, until he stood a few feet away, watching. Ethan crouched. Duke stopped. Neither moved. Several long seconds passed. Then the dog took 2 more steps forward, lowered his head, and gently pressed his nose against Ethan's hand. The contact lasted less than a second. Then Duke stepped back. The moment was tiny, almost insignificant. Yet Melissa felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Because she had seen thousands of dog-human introductions. Most were louder, bigger, more dramatic. This one felt different. It felt like trust being tested, a single inch at a time. Over the next half hour, Ethan and Duke walked the yard together. Not perfectly, not magically, awkwardly. The way real relationships begin. Sometimes Duke walked ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes beside him. No dramatic movie moment occurred. No instant bond. No life-changing realization. Just two lonely creatures learning each other's pace. And somehow, that felt more meaningful. When the visit ended, Ethan thanked Melissa, then headed toward the parking lot. The entire drive home, Duke occupied his thoughts. That wasn't surprising. What surprised him was what happened afterward. For the next several days, he couldn't stop thinking about the dog. At work, at home, while mowing grass, while eating dinner, while trying to sleep. Again and again his mind returned to those quiet brown eyes. Emily noticed immediately during a phone call. You went back to the shelter website, didn't you? Ethan laughed. How do you know? Because I know you. He didn't answer, which answered the question, so she sounded hopeful. What happened? I met a dog. Emily grinned, even though he couldn't see it. Uh-oh. What does that mean? It means you're already in trouble. I'm not adopting him. Sure. I'm serious. Of course. Ethan rolled his eyes. Yet after the call ended, he found himself smiling for the first time in days. Then reality returned. Adoption wasn't a simple decision. Not for him. Not anymore. A dog meant responsibility, routine, commitment, emotion. Loss someday. And loss was the part that frightened him most. Because grief had taught him something painful. When you love something deeply enough, eventually you'll risk losing it. Part of him wasn't sure he could survive that again. Meanwhile, back at the shelter, Melissa noticed something unusual. Duke spent the next 2 days waiting near the kennel door, watching every visitor who entered the adoption wing. More attentive than usual, more alert, as though he remembered someone, as though he expected someone. She tried not to read too much into it. Shelter workers learned that lesson early. Hope could become dangerous, especially for long-term residents. Still, she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. For the first time in months, Duke looked interested. Interested in tomorrow. Interested in possibility. Interested in something beyond the kennel walls. The problem was that Ethan hadn't called. He hadn't submitted paperwork. He hadn't scheduled another visit. And as the days passed, uncertainty began creeping back into both of their lives. One wondering whether he was capable of opening his heart again. The other wondering whether the person he had finally noticed was already gone. And neither of them knew that the hardest part of their journey hadn't even started yet. A week passed, then another, and Ethan still hadn't made a decision. Every evening he found a new reason to wait. Some reasons were practical. His fence needed repairs. His work schedule was unpredictable. The house wasn't dog-proof. He needed time to think. Other reasons were harder to admit. He was afraid. Not of Duke. Not of responsibility. Of attachment. The last few years had taught him how devastating love could become when life suddenly took someone away. Part of him had quietly built walls around himself. Walls disguised as logic. Walls disguised as caution. Walls disguised as patience. And every time he thought about filling out adoption paperwork, those walls rose higher. Meanwhile, Duke continued waiting. The shelter staff tried not to notice, but they did. After Ethan's visit, something had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for a stranger to see, but enough for people who knew him. He spent more time near the kennel gate. Less time sleeping. More time watching visitors. Almost as if a forgotten possibility had awakened inside him. Melissa hated seeing it. Because hope was complicated inside shelters. Hope could save an animal. Hope could also break one. She had witnessed both outcomes. One rainy afternoon, another family visited Duke. A young couple with 2 children. They spent 15 minutes with him in the play yard. The interaction went well. Everyone smiled. The children laughed. The parents seemed interested. For several hours afterward, Shelter employees quietly imagined what Duke's future might look like. Then the family adopted a younger dog instead. The disappointment hit harder than usual, not because it was unexpected, because Duke had looked hopeful. That evening, Melissa sat beside his kennel after closing. Duke rested quietly near the gate. She rubbed behind his ears. "You deserve better than this." His tail moved gently. She wished dogs could understand explanations. She wished she could tell him none of this was his fault. That being overlooked wasn't a reflection of his worth. That sometimes good things simply took too long, but life didn't offer those explanations. Not to people. Not to dogs. At nearly the same moment, 2 hours north, Ethan sat in his garage staring at a photograph. It showed Sarah kneeling beside Molly years earlier. The picture had been taken during a family camping trip. Sarah was laughing. Molly was covered in mud. Emily looked mortified. The memory should have made him smile. Instead, it made him cry. Not because of the photograph itself, because for the first time he realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't protecting himself from grief anymore. He was protecting himself from life. There was a difference, a huge difference. The realization followed him into the house, into bed, into the following morning, and 3 days later, it followed him all the way back to the shelter. Melissa nearly dropped her clipboard when she saw him. "You came back." Ethan laughed nervously. "Looks that way." The truth was he hadn't planned the trip. Not exactly. He had simply started driving. 1 mile became 10. 10 became 50. Before long, he was standing inside the adoption wing again. Duke noticed him immediately. Melissa saw it happen. The dog's ears lifted. His posture changed. And for the first time in months, he approached the kennel door before Ethan reached it. The moment lasted only seconds. But it was impossible to miss. Ethan noticed too. Something tightened in his chest. Not guilt, not obligation. Something deeper. Recognition again. The strange feeling that this dog somehow understood parts of him no one else could see. They spent another hour together outside. Walking, sitting, doing almost nothing. And somehow everything. The silence between them felt comfortable. Neither demanded anything. Neither performed. Neither tried to impress the other. At one point, Ethan sat on a wooden bench while Duke lay nearby. The dog rested his head on his paws, watching the clouds drift overhead. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years earlier, Sarah had once told him something while they sat on their back porch. "You know why dogs are so special? No, they don't care who you used to be." He remembered laughing. "What does that mean?" "It means they only care about who you are right now." At the time, it sounded like one of Sarah's random observations. Now it felt different. Now it felt important. Because for nearly 2 years, Ethan had been living inside memories. Inside old versions of himself. Inside loss. Duke didn't know any of that. To Duke, he was simply the man sitting beside him. Nothing more. Nothing less. Later, Melissa invited Ethan into her office. The conversation started casually, then gradually became more serious. "What are you afraid of?" The question caught him off guard. He laughed awkwardly. "That's direct. I've worked here a long time." She folded her arms. "People who don't care don't drive 2 hours twice." Ethan couldn't argue. Melissa continued. "I don't need you to adopt him." That surprised him. "I don't?" "No." She shook her head. "I need you to be honest with yourself." The room fell quiet. Outside the office window, volunteers walked dogs through the yard. Spring sunlight reflected off wet pavement. Life moved normally. Inside, Ethan struggled to answer. Eventually, he said what he had avoided saying aloud. "If I take him home..." His voice cracked slightly. Melissa waited. "If I let myself care again..." The rest remained unfinished. It didn't need finishing. She understood. Many adopters carried grief into shelters. Widowers, veterans, retirees, parents. People rebuilding after divorce. People rebuilding after loss. The animals weren't the only ones searching for second chances. Melissa leaned forward. "Can I tell you something?" Ethan nodded. "Duke isn't waiting for someone perfect." She glanced toward the kennels. "He's waiting for someone willing." Those words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. For another week, he wrestled with the decision. Every day brought new doubts. Every day brought new reasons. Emily called frequently. Friends offered opinions. Co-workers encouraged him. But ultimately, nobody could make the choice for him. Then came the phone call. The one that changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Melissa's voice sounded unusually serious. "Hey, Ethan." His stomach tightened immediately. "What's wrong?" "Duke's okay." Relief arrived. Then confusion. "Then what happened?" Melissa hesitated. "Duke's medical exam found something." The silence that followed felt endless. Not because the news was catastrophic, because it was uncertain. The veterinarian had discovered a growth that required additional testing. It might be nothing. It might not. Nobody knew yet, but the shelter would need answers. And until then, adoption discussions would pause. After the call ended, Ethan sat motionless for several minutes. The reaction surprised him. His concern felt immediate, personal, protective, as though Duke already belonged in some hidden corner of his life. That realization frightened him, because it revealed a truth he could no longer deny. Somewhere along the way, despite every defense, every excuse, every fear, he had already started caring. The problem was that now another question stood in front of him, one he never expected. If Duke wasn't perfectly healthy, if future challenges existed, if things became complicated, would he still choose him? And for the first time since Sarah died, Ethan found himself facing a decision that wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about deciding whether something was worth the risk of it. The test results took 9 days. For the shelter staff, it felt longer. For Ethan, it felt endless. Every morning he checked his phone before getting out of bed. Every afternoon, he glanced at incoming calls during work meetings. Every evening, he wondered whether he was being ridiculous. After all, Duke wasn't his dog. Not officially. Not yet. But emotions rarely follow official timelines. By the 5th day, even Emily noticed. You cared about him. They were talking on the phone during her drive home from class. Ethan stared through his kitchen window. I don't know. Yes, you do. I've met him twice. Twice was apparently enough. He couldn't argue with that, because she was right. Somewhere between the first visit and the second, Duke had stopped being a shelter dog in Ethan's mind. He had become Duke, a specific dog, a specific life, a specific future that Ethan now found himself worrying about. The realization felt both comforting and terrifying. When Melissa finally called, Ethan answered before the first ring finished. Hello? The relief in her voice arrived immediately. The growth is benign. For a second, he closed his eyes. Air escaped his lungs. A tension he hadn't fully acknowledged suddenly released. That's good. It's very good. The veterinarian expected no major problems. No cancer. No serious illness. Just a procedure and periodic monitoring. Manageable. Ordinary. The kind of thing that happened to aging dogs every day. After hanging up, Ethan sat quietly at the kitchen table. The same table where he had spent countless evenings alone. The same table where grief had become routine. The same table where indecision had lived for months. And suddenly he understood something. The medical scare hadn't pushed him away. It had done the opposite. The moment he thought Duke might face challenges, his instinct hadn't been to leave. His instinct had been to stay. That mattered more than he realized. 3 days later, he returned to the shelter. This time, there was no internal debate during the drive. No arguments, no attempts to turn around. Only clarity. Not certainty, but clarity. The difference was important. Certainty suggested guarantees. Life offered none. Clarity simply meant knowing which direction to walk despite uncertainty. Melissa met him near the lobby. The moment she saw his expression, she smiled. "You decided?" It wasn't a question. Ethan laughed. Was it that obvious? A little. They completed paperwork that afternoon. Pages of forms, references, policies, medical records, adoption agreements, normal shelter procedures. Yet every signature felt strangely significant, as though each one marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The final document sat on the desk between them. Melissa slid it forward. Ethan looked at the paper, then at Duke through the office window. The dog lay quietly in the adoption yard, completely unaware that his life was about to change. For a moment, emotion caught Ethan off guard. Not dramatic emotion, something quieter. The realization that both of them had spent years stuck. One inside a shelter, one inside grief. Different cages, same result. Slowly he signed his name. And just like that, after 742 days, Duke finally had a home. The shelter staff cried more than anyone expected, especially Melissa. She had promised herself she wouldn't. She failed almost immediately. When she clipped a leash onto Duke's collar one final time, tears blurred her vision. "You ready, buddy?" Duke wagged his tail. The shelter employees gathered near the front entrance. Volunteers, kennel workers, reception staff, people who had watched him wait, people who had hoped, people who had worried, people who had quietly feared this day might never come. As Duke walked toward the door, applause broke out. Soft at first, then louder. The dogs seemed confused. Ethan felt emotional. Melissa definitely cried. And for one beautiful moment, everyone in the building celebrated the same thing. Not a rescue, not a miracle, not luck, a chance, a simple chance. Outside, spring sunlight warmed the parking lot. Duke paused near Ethan's truck. He looked back toward the shelter, toward the building that had been his entire world for more than 2 years. Nobody knew what dogs thought in moments like that. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Then he jumped into the passenger seat and never looked back. The drive home was surprisingly uneventful. Duke spent most of it lying quietly, occasionally lifting his head, occasionally glancing out the window, occasionally checking whether Ethan was still there. By the time they reached the house, evening sunlight stretched across the neighborhood. Birds moved through budding trees. Children rode bicycles nearby. Normal life. Ordinary life. The kind Ethan hadn't fully participated in for a long time. He opened the truck door. Duke stepped out cautiously. The dog stood motionless for several seconds, taking everything in. The yard, the driveway, the sounds, the smells, the unfamiliar world. Then came the first challenge. Duke refused to enter the house. Not aggressively, not fearfully. He simply sat on the porch, watching, waiting. 30 minutes passed. Nothing changed. Ethan laughed. Seriously? Duke blinked. Another 10 minutes. Still nothing. Eventually, Ethan sat beside him. Neither spoke, obviously. Neither moved much. They simply existed together. Two stubborn creatures staring at the front door. Finally, Duke stood, walked forward, crossed the threshold. One step. Then another. The moment felt oddly symbolic. Not because entering a house was extraordinary, because starting over rarely happens all at once. It happens one hesitant step at a time. The first few weeks proved challenging. Not terrible. Not magical. Real. Duke struggled with certain noises. Vacuum cleaners made him nervous. Thunderstorms unsettled him. Being left alone caused visible anxiety. Years in a shelter had left marks, some emotional, some behavioral. Trust wasn't broken, but it wasn't automatic either. For Ethan, the adjustments were equally significant. His routines changed. His mornings changed. His evenings changed. His house changed. For the first time in years, another living creature depended on him. At first, the responsibility felt strange, then meaningful, then necessary. One evening, nearly a month after the adoption, Ethan came home exhausted. A difficult day at work, unexpected equipment failures, budget issues, employee conflicts. The kind of day that drained every ounce of energy. In the past, he would have entered an empty house, turned on the television, gone through the motions. Instead, Duke met him at the door. Nothing dramatic, just a wagging tail, a familiar presence, a quiet greeting, and unexpectedly, the loneliness felt smaller. Not gone, smaller. That night, Ethan found himself talking aloud while making dinner. Commenting on work, discussing random thoughts, sharing observations. At one point he stopped and laughed, because he was talking to a dog. Then something else occurred to him. For the first time in years, he wasn't talking to an empty room. The healing wasn't sudden. It wasn't complete, but it had begun. And neither Ethan nor Duke realized that their story was quietly affecting people beyond their home. Back at the shelter, staff members still spoke about Duke regularly. Visitors asked about him. Volunteers shared updates. People remembered. Because after waiting 742 days, some stories become impossible to forget. What nobody expected was how far that story would eventually travel, or how many lives it would inspire before it was over. 3 months after Duke's adoption, Melissa received an email with a subject line that immediately made her smile. Duke update. She opened it before finishing her morning coffee. Attached were 6 photographs. In one, Duke lay stretched across a living room rug, looking completely relaxed. In another, he sat beside Ethan on a fishing dock overlooking a small lake. A third showed him asleep with his head resting against the arm of a couch. Melissa stared at the pictures longer than she needed to. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were ordinary. For shelter workers, ordinary was often the dream. A couch, a backyard, a routine, a home. Those simple things represented everything they hoped for. When animals left their care, she forwarded the pictures to the staff. Within minutes, replies started arriving. He looks so happy. Look at his face. I can't believe that's the same dog. He finally got his family. Melissa smiled. Then she noticed something else. It wasn't just Duke who looked different. Ethan did too. The man standing beside the dog in those photographs wasn't the same man who had first walked into the shelter months earlier. His shoulders looked lighter. His smile looked genuine. His eyes looked present, alive. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. The kind of change that happens when someone slowly reconnects with life. Back in Erie, that transformation continued one small day at a time. Duke became part of Ethan's routines. Morning walks before work, evening strolls through the neighborhood, weekend trips to local parks. Simple rituals, simple moments. Yet those moments accumulated into something powerful. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Ethan for years suddenly stopped to chat. Children asked to pet Duke. Dog owners introduced themselves. Conversations started naturally. The isolation that had surrounded Ethan, after Sarah's death, slowly began to crack. Not because he forced it, because Duke created opportunities. One Saturday morning, Ethan found himself drinking coffee at a local farmer's market while Duke sat beside him. A woman selling homemade candles smiled. "Beautiful dog. Thanks. How long have you had him?" "A few months." The conversation lasted only 2 minutes. But afterward, Ethan realized something surprising. That brief exchange felt normal. For years, normal had felt impossible. Later that summer, Emily came home for a weekend visit. The moment she stepped through the front door, Duke greeted her enthusiastically. His tail nearly knocked over a lamp. Emily laughed. "Well, apparently I'm approved." "You definitely are." For the next hour, she watched Duke move comfortably through the house. The same house that had once felt frozen in time. The same house that now contained evidence of change. Dog toys in the corner. Leashes hanging near the door. Water bowls in the kitchen. Signs of life. Signs of movement. Signs of healing. That evening after dinner, Emily and Ethan sat on the back porch while Duke rested nearby. Summer air drifted through the yard. Crickets chirped in the distance. The conversation eventually became quieter, more serious. Emily looked toward Duke. "You know," she said softly, "Mom would have loved him." Ethan nodded. For a moment neither spoke. Then he surprised himself. "I think so too." Years earlier, that conversation might have ended in tears. Now it ended in something else. Warmth. Not because grief had disappeared, because grief had changed. Sarah's memory no longer felt trapped inside loss. It had become part of life again. Part of joy. Part of remembrance. Part of moving forward. As the months passed, Duke continued settling into his new world. His anxiety improved. His confidence grew. His personality emerged in ways nobody expected. The quiet shelter dog turned out to have a stubborn sense of humor. He stole socks, ignored commands he clearly understood, demanded attention during phone calls, and developed an obsession with tennis balls. The shelter staff loved every update. Each news story felt like a reward for years of waiting. Then something unexpected happened. The shelter shared Duke's adoption story online. Originally, it was meant to be a simple success post. A long-term resident finally finding a home. Nothing unusual. The response surprised everyone. Thousands of people shared it. Comments flooded in. People across the country connected with the story. Not because it involved a heroic rescue. Not because it involved tragedy. Because it felt familiar. Many readers saw themselves in Ethan. Others saw themselves in Duke. Some understood loneliness. Some understood grief. Some understood what it meant to wait for a second chance. The story spread far beyond Western Pennsylvania. Donations increased. Volunteer applications increased. Adoption inquiries increased. Several long-time shelter dogs found homes in the months that followed. Visitors arrived asking a simple question. Who's been here the longest? For years, that question had broken Melissa's heart. Now it offered hope. One afternoon, nearly a year after Duke's adoption, Melissa received another message from Ethan. This one included an invitation. The shelter's annual fundraising event was approaching. Would she like to see Duke in person? Her answer was immediate. Absolutely. The event took place at a community park outside Erie. Families gathered beneath tents. Local businesses donated prizes. Volunteers organized activities. Dogs wandered everywhere. Melissa spotted Duke almost instantly. Not because she recognized him, because she barely did. The difference was remarkable. His posture, his confidence, his energy. The defeated shelter dog was gone. In his place stood a dog who belonged. A dog who expected good things. A dog who trusted tomorrow. When Duke saw Melissa, his tail began wagging wildly. He hurried toward her. She knelt, wrapped her arms around him, and immediately started crying again. Some habits never changed. Ethan laughed. "You always do that." "Be quiet," he smiled. For a while they stood together watching families move through the event. Children played nearby. Dogs explored the grass. Volunteers shared stories. Life unfolded in ordinary ways. Then Melissa asked a question. One she had wondered about for months. When did you know? Ethan looked down at Duke. The answer took a moment. Finally he said, "It wasn't one moment." Melissa waited. "It was 100 little moments," he smiled. "The first time he greeted me at the door. The first walk. The first time I laughed without realizing it. The first time the house didn't feel empty." His voice softened. "I think I kept believing I rescued him." Melissa nodded. "A lot of people say that." Ethan shook his head. "No." He looked at Duke again. "I think we rescued each other." For a moment nobody spoke, because there wasn't much to add. Sometimes the simplest truths were the most powerful. As evening approached, families began heading home. Volunteers packed equipment. The event slowly wound down. Before leaving, Melissa watched Ethan and Duke walk across the park together. One man, one dog. Nothing extraordinary. And yet everything about it felt extraordinary, because she remembered the kennel, the waiting, the uncertainty, the 742 days. She remembered wondering whether anyone would ever choose him, whether anyone would ever see beyond the number attached to his file, whether anyone would ever recognize what had been there all along. And now she had her answer. The truth was that Duke had never needed a perfect owner. Ethan had never needed a perfect dog. They simply needed someone willing to show up, someone willing to stay, someone willing to take a chance despite uncertainty. Years later, people would still tell Duke's story, not because it was dramatic, not because it was miraculous, but because it reminded them of something easy to forget. The longest waits do not always end in disappointment. The most overlooked lives are not always forgotten. And sometimes after 742 days of being passed by, all it takes is one person willing to stop walking. Because the decision that changed Duke's life forever wasn't made the day Ethan signed the adoption papers. It was made the moment two lonely souls looked at each other and quietly chose hope over fear. And in the end, that choice gave both of them the same thing they had been searching for all along. Not a rescue, not a miracle, a home.